Hello and welcome to Introducing Object-Oriented Programming. Object-oriented programming is what we call a programming paradigm. So it's a whole different way of thinking about how we write programs. Up to now, we've been thinking of programs as being written in terms of functions, and in object-oriented programming, or OOP, we're going to start thinking of writing programs in terms of the objects that exist in our program. A lot of people feel that this is a more intuitive way to write programs, so hopefully that turns out to be true for you. I think it's a great way of writing programs, and it's in particular very suitable when we're talking about writing simulations, which has been a focus for this course. So let's get into it by beginning with an example. So I've got a kind of pre-made example here. It's also in the notes for this module. And let's just go and look at what it looks like first. So what we've got is a program that creates a garden, right? So we've got these flowers. I guess they're meant to be poppies, is what I was thinking. And they're kind of randomly positioned around on the canvas. And if I were to reload and relaunch the program, you can see that they end up in different places. So that's what I want to begin with, just so that we've got something to work with. So let's quickly look at how this code is working. Of course, we use strict to begin with, because that's just good programming practice. The first thing that we have that's important is an object that I'm using to represent the overall garden. Now, I could have made each of these things separate variables, but I thought it was a nice idea to have the garden itself as an object that I can then have the various pieces of the program that are related to the garden stored in there as properties. So as you can see, we've got a property called flowers that's going to have an array in it. You'll notice that we can have an array as the value inside a property. So we've got an empty array inside flowers that will store all of the flowers. We've got a property that tells us how many flowers are going to be in the garden. Currently that's 20. And we've got a property that determines the color of the grass, which is just the background color, right? So that's part one. Part two is setup. So that's, well, I can't quite fit it all on my screen, so I'll just begin with the setup function. So in the setup function, of course, we create a canvas, as we always do. And because I'm dealing with an array that I'm going to store flowers in, I have a for loop. And my for loop counts from 0 up to the number of flowers that are meant to be drawn in my garden, using that garden.numFlowers property. And each time through the loop, it creates a flower with a createFlower function, which we're going to look at in a moment, and it adds that flower to the array of flowers in the garden by using push. So by the end of this for loop, we'll have 20 flowers inside the array, inside the flowers array, because that's what is in numFlowers. The actual createFlower function it's a little bit long because I've got quite a few properties for my flowers, just because I was interested in being able to control the visuals of a flower a little bit more than usual. So you can see in createFlower, we create an object and store it in the flower variable here. It's got a random position, size is 50, and then it's got a couple of other size things. So this size here refers to the size of the center of a flower. Stem length is how long the stem is, as you might imagine, extending from the center of the flower downwards. Thickness is how thick the stem is. Petal thickness is how thick the rim around the central area is. So if we're looking at this, here's the stem here, obviously. The center is this darker color, and the petals are this brighter color here. And then we have the color information. Color of the stem, color of the petals around the outside, and color of the center on the inside. So quite a lot of stuff going on there, but it's just a series of properties. We return that flower from the function, and that's what allows this createFlower function here inside the for loop to repeatedly create new flowers at random positions. It stores them in this flower variable, and then they get added to the array. So we end up with an array full of flowers. What a beautiful thing. Must smell amazing, I imagine. Given that they're poppies, you could do other things with them too, I suppose. But that's neither here nor there. In our draw function, we set the background. We set it to the grass color, the R, G, and B properties of our grass color, so we get that green color in the background. And then again, because we're dealing with things inside an array, we use a for loop to go through that array. We count up to garden.flowers.length, so we get the length of the array to make sure we see every single flower in the array. Again, this is important just in case the number of flowers in the array changes. Our for loop will keep working even if that happens. Although we don't do that in this program currently. Each time through, we grab the flower at the current position determined by I. So the first time through we get the flower at position 0, index 0, then 1, then 2, etc. And we call display flower, passing it that flower as an argument. And as you might imagine, display flower does the work of drawing that particular kind of flower shape on the screen. It draws a line for the stem, and then it draws an ellipse with the stroke weight controlling kind of the size of the petals. I won't go into detail here. It's just some shapes, right? And you can see it's using all of the properties of this flower, like flower.stem thickness, flower.x, etc. Okay, so that's our program yielding this, a field of poppies. Wonderful. Looks great. And you know, clearly we could do stuff with this immediately, and you might be thinking of things that you would change. But what I want to do is use that as the basis to talk about object-oriented programming, because in a sense this is already a program that is focused on objects, right? Importantly, even just looking at this visual representation here, you can see that each flower is an object, right? Each flower is an individual entity in this program. We know that because they are literally represented as JavaScript objects, in particular JavaScript object literals. Those get created by the create flower function here. So it's creating objects and storing them in the array. And then those objects have things done to them by functions, well, by one specific function in our program, which is display flower, which displays them. So this is a program about objects, but you can see that the code to do with these objects is kind of spread out, right? For instance, there is the code that determines what an object, what a flower object has as properties, which is right here. That's inside a function that deals with creating flowers. And then there's another function further down that deals with displaying flowers. So there's this information about what a flower is and how a flower works is kind of spread out in the program into at least two different places, right? Creating flowers and displaying flowers. That's fine, like this clearly works perfectly well, but the fact that we have this idea of flowers both with properties, such as size and position, and functions that deal with what a flower can kind of do, like be created and be displayed, it kind of suggests that a nice way to think about this would be if we could combine all of that stuff into one place. That would be the place that we just talk about what a flower is and how it works, right? That would potentially make our program clear, or clearer, more modular, and maybe more reusable as well. And again, it won't surprise you to learn that this is what object-oriented programming does for us. In object-oriented programming, basically we think about a program as being organized into different kinds of objects, different classes of objects, each of which has properties, the sort of the qualities of that object, and functions, the things that control what that object can do or how it behaves. And the way that we do this, and that's what we're going to cover right now, is that we write these things called classes. And in object-oriented programming, a class is the code that describes how some kind of object, like a flower, behaves. That is, what are the properties and functions of a specific kind of object. And a class is kind of like the template that describes how that object works. So this will be obviously significantly clearer as we actually do this. So let's do it. Okay, well, the first step is that we need a class, right? We need a class. It's going to be called flower because it's going to describe how a flower works. Now, when we create classes, the best practice is actually that we're going to put them in a separate file. And this is actually one of the advantages of doing object-oriented programming like this. We'll separate all of the information about flowers into a completely separate file. So our first step is going to be to create a new file for this class. I'm going to do that by right-clicking on the JS folder and selecting New File from the contextual menu here. And I'm going to call this file flower.js. Note the capital F there. It's traditional to name the file that you've got a class in with the name of the class, and you capitalize the first letter. So flower.js with a capital F. I'm going to create that file. Okay, so now I've got a new blank file, and it's in this file that I'm going to write all of the code that tells the program about what a flower is and what a flower does, okay? And to begin that process, because as I said, we're defining a class, we have to give the basic skeleton for how that works. And the way that we do that, the syntax is that we write class. That's what tells JavaScript that we're going to define a class in this file. Then we write the name of the class. Just as with the file name here, you should capitalize the first letter of a class. So it's flower with a capital F is the name of the class. And then we have curly brackets to define the block of code inside this class that's going to determine how a flower works. Okay? Those are the key pieces to beginning a template, or a class, rather. You may have noticed that I did not include use strict up here. I could have, but one good thing to know about object-oriented programming is that when we define a class, as we are doing here with the flower class, it is automatically in strict mode. So we don't actually need to worry about activating it for this specific file. So we're all good on use strict. So before we start filling in this class, obviously it doesn't do anything right now. This would be a pretty hopeless flower, sort of like a null flower. There's one more thing that we always need to do when we're creating a new class, and that is that because we've created a new file, and really this is true of any new file, any new JavaScript file you create, we need to tell index.html that this new file is part of our project, right? So here you can see is a script tag, and this is what tells my program to include the program that I've written in script.js. Currently that's pretty empty. Currently that's got the whole flower simulation in it. My bad, garden simulation. I need to do the same thing for my new file, flower.js. So I'm just going to duplicate this line, and instead of having script, I'm going to write flower here. So I want to also include the flower.js file in my program, otherwise my program won't be able to use it. The other thing that's important here is that I want to include this tag for flower.js before my script, because my script is going to use the flower class that I'm going to define in this file, and so it needs to load the flower file first. Nice alliteration there, flower file first. Okay, so that's done. So we're kind of ready. I can close this now. We're ready to define our flower class, okay? So the very first thing that you're always going to want to do when you're defining a class is that the main thing that this class does is it's going to be used to create flowers, right? We're going to create new flower objects that know how to be flowers, and we're going to use them in our program. And the class is going to describe how they work, but the very first thing that you're going to need to do is tell the class how to create one of these flowers. And in particular, we're going to use that to tell it how to set up the properties of one of these flowers. Now, you can't just choose any old name for this. We can't call it create or create flower or let there be flower or I want there to be a flower or whatever. The function that we're going to use here always has the same name in a class, and it's called constructor because it constructs an object for that class. That's just the terminology that they use. So it's called constructor, written that way. Importantly, you notice I don't write function here, okay? I mean, it is a kind of a function, but we don't need to write the word function there, and we shouldn't, because JavaScript, because we're inside a class definition here, it just knows that what I'm going to be putting in here are functions, function definitions, right? So we've got the special name, constructor, and this is going to be the function that I use to set up a flower when I create it. The other thing to point out, and I'll start using this terminology from now on, is that technically in object-oriented programming, when we're talking about functions that are part of a class definition like this, we call them methods. It's just a piece of terminology here. So I will now be referring to the functions that exist inside a class as methods. So this is the constructor method that we use to create a flower. So what do we want to put in this constructor? Well, we've got our example over in the main script, so we know what it is to create a flower. We know that what we want to end up with is an object with all of these properties here, right? X, Y, size, stem length, etc., etc. That's what I want. So I want all of this stuff here to be in my definition of how you make a flower in the first place. And basically I can do roughly the same thing over here in flower.js. So I'm actually going to copy all of this stuff, and I'm going to make some modifications to make it work properly in my flower constructor. So I'm going to paste that in. Now, currently this doesn't work because you can't write JavaScript code like this. We're not inside an object literal, so we can't use this sort of property and then colon syntax with the commas. But we can do something very, very similar. And to do so, I'm just going to change them, and then I will talk about what the big change is. So you can see I'm selecting the front of all of these property names, and I'm writing this and then a dot. And I'm also going to select all of these colons, which I can't use. Colon, colon, colon. Probably could have done this in a smarter way, but it's too late now, and I'm not that smart. I'm going to use assignment, because that's how you normally put values inside variables. And instead of commas here, because commas make no sense, again, because we're writing just regular code right now, I'm going to put a semicolon. But first I have to delete that semicolon, and then I have to pay attention to the fact that I just deleted a curly bracket there. Okay, so this is the correct way to do this in the constructor. Okay, so this is how I'm going to create a new flower object. And there's, as you literally just saw, there's a couple of key differences. One of the big differences is that I don't need to declare a new flower variable up here. I don't need to say something like let flower up here. And that's because the constructor is already making a new flower, right? That's what the constructor does. So it's already assumed that there is this variable that's going to exist that will hold the new flower. And when I'm inside my class, the name of that thing that holds the current flower that's either being constructed or later on that we're doing other things with, that variable is called this. So that's a special variable name, right? That we can't use for anything else. This refers to the current object that we are making in this constructor. So it gets defined for us automatically by JavaScript when we have a class. So this refers to the current flower. In this instance, it's the current flower being constructed. And then I can assign values, so I can create properties for this flower that I'm talking about by using the standard dot notation, right? So this refers to the current flower object, and I can say dot x, and that accesses the x property of that flower, and I'm assigning a random location on the x-axis. The other important thing here that we're seeing is that I don't need to sort of tell JavaScript that I'm making a new property here called x in this instance. I can just make that property come into existence by referring to it here, by assigning a value to it here. So this is the current flower, and by saying this.x, I'm saying there is an x property for this flower, and this is the value here. Okay? So I'm making all of these properties come into existence by assigning values to them. The other thing that you're probably noticing is that at the end of the constructor here, I don't need to return anything. Again, you might think that I would say return this, because that's the thing that I've been setting up. But this again is implicit. I don't actually need to write that. It will automatically return the flower that is being constructed in this way. Okay? So quite a bit going on there. This is the syntax for creating these things. We have a class called flower. Inside the class we have a method called constructor. That is the official name of how you make a new flower. It's always called constructor like this. And in it we can set up the properties of our flower that we're creating by saying this, which refers to the object being created by my constructor. I give it properties by saying this dot property name and then assigning values to them. So it has an x property, a y property, a size property, etc. And I don't need to return anything because the constructor does that automatically. So this is how a constructor works in the most basic sense. We set up a bunch of properties, and now we have a flower that is set up in the same way that we were previously setting it up. Okay? We have by the end of the constructor, we have all of the properties that a flower is meant to have set to default values. But that's not everything that we need to do with a flower, right? Currently this is about making a flower, but in our main script, again, if we go and refer to what we do with flowers, the other thing that we do is we display them, right? This code here is being used to display a flower provided as a parameter. So I'm going to copy that code again because we will use that code. So our current flower class, it needs to know how to make a flower, but it also needs to know how to display a flower. So I need another method. And again, I don't need to write the word function. I just need to write the method name, which is display in this instance. Parentheses, if I had any parameters, they would go in there, but I don't. And then I'm going to paste in that code. And again, I'll need to make some changes here for this to work. So note here that I don't really need to call this display flower, right? Because we're in the flower class, so it's sort of implicit that this method displays flowers, so I'm just going to call it display. That's a better name for it. In here, I want to do exactly the same things, right? I want to set a stroke weight and a stroke and draw a line and so forth to draw that same kind of flower that I had, but I don't have a parameter called flower. So how do I refer to the flower that I want to display, right? It's the flower that has been created with this template. So what am I going to call it? I'm going to call it this. This always refers to the current flower. So I'm going to select all of these instances where it says flower, and again, I really should have done find and replace, but this is kind of satisfying. I know that you enjoy this too. Everybody enjoys multiple cursors. Again, if you don't use this, you should start using it. On Mac, you hold down Command and select things, and on PC, I believe that you use the Control key. So I'm going to replace all of these things that refer to a flower parameter, which doesn't exist, with the word this. And this will refer to the current flower that is being displayed. So whichever flower we just told to display, this will refer to that flower, and so I can get access to all of the properties associated with that flower. So now our flower does the same things, right? It can be constructed, that is, we can create new ones by setting all of the properties, and it can be displayed, which it can do by using those properties to do the same tasks, drawing lines and an ellipse, drawing a line and an ellipse. Okay. So now we have a class definition. This is a complete class definition for a flower. It does the same things that a flower was able to do back in my main script. So let's now go back to the main script. We're no longer going to need a display flower function here because that's going to be taken care of by my class. And I also don't need a create flower function because that's also being handled by my class now. So our main script is going to get simpler, right? And that is always going to be a good thing. So what do we need to change? Well, we're still going to have an array of flowers. We're still going to be talking about flower objects, right? They're just being created in this new way using a class. So we don't need to change anything up here with our garden because we still want an array. So how do I go from here, where I was using the create flower function, which I've just deleted, breaking the program, how do I create a new flower out of this class definition that I've created? It's really quite simple, and it's quite a pleasing piece of syntax. I want to create a new flower. What I say is I want to say create a new. I literally write the word new. You can see this is a special word. It goes purple there. And then to tell it that what I want to create is a flower, I write the name of the class, flower, with a big F, right? That's got to match, and parentheses. Now what this is really doing is this here is going to call the constructor, right? So over here it's called constructor. That's the constructor for the flower class. But when I actually want to use this constructor, I write new and then the name of the class followed by parentheses. That's slightly weird. You would think maybe that you would say something like constructor, or maybe even you would just say constructor like this, but that won't work. And you can imagine why. In part, if we add another class, its constructor will also be called constructor, and now JavaScript wouldn't know which one to use here, right? There's not enough information. So the way that we get around that is, well, for the first thing, we always write new, because that says that we're going to use a class constructor, not just some function in our program. And we write the name of the class with the parentheses after it. And this will ensure that we use the flower constructor to make a flower. It will then be stored in this flower variable, same way that we were doing before, and then it will be pushed onto the array, so that we build up, again, 20 flowers. But this time, those flowers are defined by this class. That's the big difference. Continuing on, we want to do roughly the same idea down here, right? Instead of calling the display flower function and passing it a specific flower to display, now we want to do something slightly different, which is we've just pulled a flower out of the garden, so to speak. We didn't pluck it or anything. We're just getting it out of the array. So this flowers array at position I, or index I, starts at 0 and counts all the way up. We get the flower at that particular location, and then we want to talk to that flower because that flower now has a method for displaying itself, right? So we say flower, and then we can say dot, just like we would access any property of this object, like size or x or y, etc. We can now call the methods inside its class definition. So we can get access to the display method just by saying flower. This is the variable that has the flower in it, dot display, and that's telling it do the stuff in the display method, which is to say use all of your properties to draw a line and an ellipse with those properties so that you look like a flower. Okay, so flower.display, just in the same way that we, for example, do garden.grassColor, which accesses a property. We can do the same thing to access methods. So that will now, at least in theory, let's go and check if we've got any terrible errors. Oh, we don't. That's truly incredible that I did not introduce a single error. Well, we have the same thing, right? Like this is the same garden. Functionally, we have an identical program. Every time I reload it, it displays a random set of flowers in different locations, but this program is now working with object-oriented programming. Each of these flowers that we're seeing represented here was created with that constructor inside the flower class definition, and it's being displayed with the display method inside the flower class definition. So it's functionally the same, but it is clearly, I like to think, a nicer way of writing a program like this, because our main program now is much, much simpler, right? We have our garden, and all we need to know is that we're going to create new flowers. We don't need to look at what that means in this main script. If we're interested, we'll go look at the class definition, and we can display flowers by using the method from that class definition. So everything to do with how a flower actually works is all tidied away in this one nice script here that allows us to create flowers by setting a set of properties and display flowers by doing the appropriate work with shapes. That means that if I want to change a flower, for example, I want to make them all have, 100 pixel centers, I just change it in the flower class, and now all of the flowers that get created look a little bit more like weird stubby lollipops than they did before. So all of this code is modular, right? It's all nicely encapsulated in this one file, this one class called flower, and I think that this adds a lot to the clarity. And as we will see over time, this is very highly reusable, right? We can create as many of these flowers as we want, for example, and we could do this in the previous program, but now, for instance, we could have 100 flowers. We could go back and look at that, 100 flowers on the screen, wonderful. And our program remains nice and simple, nice and clean. That separation of what a flower is from what our main program does allows a lot of clarity. So I hope that that kind of makes sense as an initial move. We haven't necessarily leveraged a huge amount about how this works, but I think that this, at the very least, you can see how this will clarify the nature of your programs. And that is a huge part of the point of object-oriented programming. It's a way of thinking about programs and writing programs that hopefully makes them clearer and easier to use for you and for everyone you know and love if you want to teach other people about it, including your pets. I should really go. I'm clearly starting to ramble. Thanks for watching this one, and we'll continue on in the next video. Bye for now.